Hi, everyone. I'm Eve Samples, Executive Director at Friends of the Everglades. We are here with a Friends of the Everglades live update at this midpoint in the session of the Florida Legislature. What better way to celebrate Valentine's Day than to talk about the work of our lawmakers up in Tallahassee? Thank you all and our audience for joining us. We have had such immense response to these live streams, particularly this year. We know there are a lot of you out there who want to understand what lawmakers are doing in far off Tallahassee, want to understand how it affects your life, the environment that we all care about. And we're going to dive into that today. And we have a great guest to help us understand the bigger picture, which I'll get to in a moment. First, I want to thank the Tierney and Wetzel Foundation for underwriting not just this live stream, but our legislative accountability work. This foundation really sees the value in helping everyday people understand the complexities of the Florida legislature and, again, how it impacts our environment. So thanks to the Tierney and Wetzel Foundation, and thanks to those of you who tuned in. So I'm going to get to our guests now. First, I'm actually very, very excited about our guest, Ryan Smart, who is Executive Director of the Florida Springs Council. Ryan does a fantastic job helping people get a grip on policy, specifically impacting the Florida Springs, which, like the Everglades, are a really unique ecosystem, valuable to our economy, really important to our water supply, and yet not what maybe your typical tourist thinks about in terms of Florida's environment. So the Springs and the Everglades allies, which tend to be grassroots in nature, I think are stronger together. And Ryan, we're really grateful to have you here today. Welcome.
Thanks, Steve. Happy to be here.
Thanks. And next we have Gil Smart, no relation to Ryan Smart that I know of. I'm sure you guys get that a lot. Gil wears two hats. He's both the policy director for Friends of the Everglades and executive director of Vote Water. He's here today in his capacity with Friends of the Everglades. Welcome, Gil.
We're actually identical twins, so if you want to look closely at the live stream here.
All right, good. Well, we will have some double trouble then. Before we dive into this midpoint in the legislative session, I want to make kind of a public service announcement, unfortunately related to some bad news impacting the Everglades. So just this morning, the Army Corps of Engineers announced that it's going to begin damaging discharges from Lake Okeechobee this coming Saturday, east of the St. Lucie River at 1,800 cubic feet per second, west of the Caloosahatchee River at 4,000 cubic feet per second. There's no set date, end date in sight for these discharges because Lake Okeechobee is alarmingly high. So this is really at the heart of our work at Friends of the Everglades, fixing the plumbing, water quality issues. And those of you who recall a toxic 2018, as it was known, know we could be in for a really rough year this year. So I didn't want to dive into the nitty gritty without acknowledging that, because the Florida legislature does have a role to play in ensuring we avoid toxic algae crises like the one that could be ahead of us this year. So with that said, we're going to start by talking about session. And I want to remind our audience of just a few issues we flagged when Gil and I did a pre-session live stream about a month ago. So we were watching two battlefronts looming, wetlands protections and growth management. And we do have some movement on those fronts that Gil is going to update you on. Also, fertilizer ordinances were looming large at that time, still looming large, but we have an update for you there that may be a little less alarming for now. And finally, I'll just say that our mid-session report debuted at everglades.org this morning. For those of you who want to read it and really wade through each bill, you can go to our website, click on legislative accountability, and read up on the bills that we're going to be talking about now. So without further ado, Gil, I'll hand it over to you to walk us through where we are right now.
Okay, well, where we are is interesting. Here, I need to be able to pull up our, there it is. Allie Hartman is working behind the screens or behind the scenes for us here. Allie, if you could kindly advance the slides, that would be very helpful. So we started out this session worried because, our legislative priorities for the year included things like preserving wetlands protections, keeping an eye on the fertilizer ordinances, stopping sprawl, that sort of thing. Hold on a second here. I apologize for this. I am unable to advance the slides right now.
No worries.
Hang on, I'm going to stop the screen sharing and then I'm going to start doing so again. I apologize for this. Okay, are we seeing this now? Okay. Legislative session began January 9th, ends Friday, March 8th. Kathleen Pasadomo, Senate President there, Paul Renner, House Speaker. Again, this is what I was talking about. These are our legislative priorities for this year. Protect wetlands was number one. Get serious about toxic algae, failing BMAPs, don't ban fertilizer bans, development, sugarcane burning, and sending more clean water south. So we went into this session sort of loaded for bear, expecting the worst. It's been an interesting session because, and I hesitate to even articulate this because, knock wood, these are famous last words. A lot of what we feared initially going in has not come to pass, at least not yet. And I'll give you an example. This pair of bills was our public enemy number one right out of the gate. House Bill 527 from Rep. Randy Maggard and Senate Bill 664 from Senator Danny Burgess. This took direct aim at wetlands. Again, our number one priority this year. It would have required wetlands buffer zones established by counties or municipalities to be acquired, which would have cost counties and municipalities billions of dollars, effectively ending their local wetlands protections. I am happy to say these bills have gone nowhere. Neither of them has had a single committee hearing, making it extremely unlikely that these are going to pass this year. Again, this was public enemy number one as far as we were concerned.
And Gil, can I jump in there real quick?
Please feel free.
You and Ryan, why do you think these stagnated? Any theories?
I'll let Ryan take a crack at that one.
I don't know, but I'm glad to see that they didn't move. I think this was a huge step backwards for wetlands protection for local governments, and also a completely unworkable bill. I mean, to require counties, municipalities to go around and try to acquire each and every easement, a buffer zone, is impossible. So I think we have to look out for more stuff like this next year. But I'm glad to see this didn't move this year.
Yeah. And it should be noted that Maggard last year had proposed a bill which would have effectively prevented local communities from passing any regulations having to do with water. That bill also went nowhere. So are we sensing a pattern here? I don't know. But, like I said, this looks very, very unlikely to advance this year. And for those of us who are fans of clean water, that's a very good thing. This is still an evolving situation, an interesting situation. This was also one of the ones of this pair of bills that we were very, very opposed to initially, because both bills, as it says here, entitled Prevailing Parties in a Legal Challenge Against FDEP or a Water Management District to Recover Attorney Fees and Costs if you sued over a permit or some other authorization and lost. In that, it's a continuation of legislation passed last year that had a similar mandate in terms of people who challenge local government comprehensive plan or comp plan amendments to sort of penalize a small, individual citizens or small environmental groups who would dare challenge an FDEP or water management district decision. We were very pleased to see that language stripped out of the bill after there was, both of our organizations here sort of rang the alarm bells. And as a result, hundreds, if not thousands of people contacted the legislature to voice their opposition to this. At the same time, there arose some significant questions about whether this was going to pass muster with the federal EPA, Environmental Protection Agency, which was formulating regulations which basically said to make the losing side pay the prevailing party's fees, limited access to the courts, which is a no-no. So there was significant opposition, there was significant questions, and lo and behold, happily, that language got stripped out of both bills. Something else these bills both initially proposed to do was requiring quote unquote holistic reviews of the coastal permitting process, perhaps to make it more efficient, speed up the process. We were also very wary of this House Bill 789 actually dropped that language, but Senate Bill 738 retains that language. And there is always the chance that these bills could be changed, restored, if you want to use that term, as we go through the process now. So we are not declaring victory on these bills. We are saying we need to keep the pressure on. Again, thus far, the worst provisions of these bills have been stripped out. But, that's always subject to change with our August legislature.
Yeah, and I'll just chime in, Gil, with a big thanks to supporters of Friends of the Everglades and the Florida Springs Council who weighed in with the subcommittee chair and really let her know, Stevenson, let her know that this was not palatable. This was not something that citizens wanted, and she didn't agenda it, and the bill evolved. So those voices made a difference.
Absolutely. And I know, Ryan, your organization also mobilized people big time.
Yeah, and I think, this was a priority for Associated of Florida, the Chamber of Commerce, and Association of Community Developers. So, being able to apply that pressure on 404 and having, thousands of contacts going to those legislators, I think this is an enormous win for groups like mine that do a lot of work in the courtrooms challenging bad rules. And both these bills are actually up tomorrow. So we should have some more clarity on what's going to happen tomorrow afternoon.
Right. And in fact, at an early hearing, Ryan testified, and it was almost an emotional moment. You basically said, if this passes, it's going to make it impossible for organizations like the Florida Springs Councils to actually bring challenges. It was a definite concern. And I don't know that that was Burgess's bill 738. I don't know that he was moved by that, but I think a lot of people were. So, because we need organizations like this questioning the process. So. Here's what could be a big win if it does in fact clear the finish line. This is protecting the Everglades Protection Area. It's House Bill 723, Senate Bill 1364, requiring comprehensive plan and plan amendments to land within or near the Everglades Protection Area to follow a state coordinated review process to mitigate any impacts on the Everglades Protection Area. As we understand it, there are several proposals for housing developments within 2 miles of the Everglades Protection Area. If this bill passes, and similar bills have been proposed in recent years. Last year, an equivalent bill got as far as the Senate floor and just never made it over the final hurdles. But if this bill passes, it will require any sort of proposed development to go through this fairly intensive process, again, trying to identify how this could impact the Everglades Protection Area and how we can make sure that doesn't happen. Senate Bill 1364 has passed its first 2 committee stops. It's on its final committee stop, the Rules Committee. 723 passed its first subcommittee stop. It has not advanced beyond that. We're hoping it will. This is legislation whose time has come, and we are hopeful that it is going to cross the finish line.
For folks who might not know what the Everglades Protection Area is, it's defined in state law. It includes the water conservation areas, Arthur R. Marshall, Loxahatchee National Wildlife Refuge, and Everglades National Park. So a vast area south of Lake Okeechobee that many of you care about, that we care deeply about, and we should not allow uncoordinated development within 2 miles of it. It's literally the least we can do.
But bad bills are still looming. Last session, and Ryan, I'm not sure if your organization was part of this. You might have been. We called last session, 2023, the session of Sprawl. But this session could be called the session of Sprawl too. It's back. And there were numerous bills this year that basically would make it easier for sprawling development to pave over every blade of grass in Florida. This bill is chief among them. Well, I'm calling it a super sprawl bill. It's awaiting a vote on the House floor. It actually would change the definition of urban sprawl to mean only an unplanned or uncontrolled development pattern. Well, even the worst growth in Florida, even the most damaging growth in Florida isn't unplanned or uncontrolled. It's planned or controlled in some way. So it basically neuters the definition to make it effectively meaningless. And it would also, among other things, it would allow infill development to avoid public scrutiny and be approved administratively. So think about that. We have seen some proposals here on our own. We're based in Martin County, where there's been some infill development. I'm thinking about a town called Jensen Beach. where, if the development under this bill, if the development would be deemed to be similar to surrounding development, it could just go through with administrative approval and there would be no public meetings. There would be no opportunity for the public to weigh in. This bill is bad news, and unfortunately, it's going to get a vote on the House floor. So, other dubious bills. Here's another one having to do with sprawl, 665-812. This would require some governing bodies to allow at least half building permits to be issued before final plat is approved. There were a number of legislative proposals this year aimed at expediting residential building proposals, because apparently we're not building homes fast enough in Florida. We have to build them even faster. The danger with this is, you're going to potentially reduce oversight, because particularly a lot of smaller municipalities and counties simply do not have the staff to keep up. And some of these legislative proposals have actually included measures suggesting that, or stating that if these approvals aren't, or it's not approved or denied within a certain time frame, it's deemed automatically approved. So again, you can see how some of these bills would ultimately reduce oversight of development and housing. 665 is on the House floor. 812 is in its final committee stop. Rules was this morning. I have not seen how that was voted on, but I'm going to assume that it was probably passed. Below this is House Bill 1547, Senate Bill 1628. This raised a huge red flag when we first saw it. Some of the worst aspects of it have been taken out, but it would still require local governments to issue business impact statements when it comes to land use decisions. It would basically require state agencies to investigate the impacts on these businesses and force local governments to hold public hearings to address complaints and to try to minimize or eliminate potential negative impacts. So this is kind of like Big Brother looming over local government, saying, well, sort of keep an eye on any sort of decisions they make. Now, the bills do not require local governments to mitigate the impacts, but it basically, I would say, harasses them and suggests that they should. So House Bill 1547 is the State Affairs Committee. Senate Bill 1628 is on its second stop in fiscal policy. Other bad bills we got on the bubble here. House Bill 957, Senate Bill 1210, Estero Bay Aquatic Preserve. This would actually shrink the aquatic preserve. The Senate bill's on its third committee stop. The House bill never got a hearing. We're watching this one. We are afraid this could serve as a bad example for attempts to shrink maybe aquatic preserves elsewhere. House Bill 1177, Senate Bill 1110, land development. Among other things, this would make it so that previously approved DRIs, developments of regional impact, would be able to make some changes with administrative approval. Again, no opportunity for the public to weigh in on that. House Bill 1177 is in the Ways and Means Committee, but 1110 never got a hearing. So we're hopeful it won't move. This was a big one for us, and I know Ryan can say the same. This was a big one for people across Florida as the session began. You may recall last session, literally in the waning days, there was a measure snuck into a budget implementing bill which authorized IFAS at the University of Florida to conduct a study on the efficacy of urban fertilizer ordinances with summer blackout periods. Something like 18 counties and 100 municipalities across Florida have one of these, which basically says you can't apply fertilizer with nitrogen and phosphorus over the summer rainy months. Makes sense because the rain's just going to wash it off. But as part of this last year, there a temporary ban on new ordinances being adopted by other communities was implemented. And so that went as far as, there was a study submitted to the legislature prior to the beginning of this session, and everyone expected and still expects some attempt to fund. The smaller study recommended that a larger study be done. So we're expecting some attempt to fund a larger study, and as part of that, maybe extend the ban. So we've been watching this like a hawk. I know Ryan has been doing the same, and a lot of other groups have been doing the same. Nothing yet. This is not in the budget proposals we've seen so far. And again, there's a whole bunch of people keeping an eye out on this, but we have not seen it yet. Are we going to see it? But, maybe we wouldn't have. We still got, several weeks left to go in session. It's possible that we will see another sneak attack at the last minute, as was the case last year when this was, came around the first time.
Yeah, and I just want to ask Ryan to chime in, because we know in the greater Everglades region that these municipal fertilizer ordinances can help, right? They're popular among residents. They reduce nutrient pollution. They don't address the largest single source of nutrient pollution to the greater Everglades, but they do help. Is it the same in the Springs region, Ryan?
Yeah, absolutely. About 12% of our pollution in the outstanding Florida Springs comes from urban fertilizer. So this is, one of those things that it's not the biggest source, as you said, but it might be the most cost effective. Mm-hmm. It does not require any major projects. It really has a very small fiscal impact. And communities that have done this, they like it, right? We've seen, we haven't seen anybody rolling backwards. We've seen more and more communities want to adopt these kind of ordinances, want to adopt stronger ordinances. It just doesn't make sense for the legislature to be taking away a tool for achieving water quality from local governments, many of whom are on the hook to meet certain reduction requirements. And if if we're not getting these reductions, you have to ask the question, who's going to have to pay to make those reductions elsewhere? So to me, this is really the lowest hanging fruit, and something that, we should be moving towards requiring these in our areas that have impaired waterways, not banning them.
Right. I mean, that's a good point. This is literally, and we've been saying this all along, this is literally the least any local government can do in terms of trying to limit nutrient pollution. And if we can't even do this, how are we going to do the heavier lifting, which needs to be done?
Yeah. Correct me if I'm wrong, guys, but the only group or groups, to my knowledge, that wants this is the fertilizer industry. True Green pushed to get this sneak attack in the budget last time. I don't know of anyone else who's asking for fewer fertilizer ordinances.
Me neither.
Yep. All right. I'm going to hand it over to Ryan here. Some of the stuff that his organization has been following.
Senate Bill 1126 and House Bill 1641. These are the bills that would preempt all regulation of what they call auxiliary containers, which is basically anything you can carry out of a store, whether it be single use or multiple use. The legislature required the Department of Environmental Protection to do a study to make recommendations, and they put a moratorium on new local regulations during that time. DEP came out with their study. It had a long list of recommendations for the legislature to adopt. The legislature adopted none of those. And instead, they've come back and not only trying to continue to stop new ordinances, but would actually remove all of the ordinances in place around the state. From a Springs perspective, we have some of our most visited and most special spring state parks like Rainbow, Weeki Wachee, and Echetucknee that currently have single-use plastic restrictions. And you actually have local governments like Marion County and the city of Dunellen that have local ordinances that match up with those state park ordinances. And all of that would go away. And we know these ordinances work. I volunteer for a cleanup group that deals with 2 rivers that have ordinances, the 2 rivers that don't. We pick up literally tens of thousands of pounds of trash from the rivers without ordinances, and we pick up about 100 pounds of trash from the 2 rivers that including one of the most visited state parks in the entire state, Echetucknee, and Rainbow, which also has a huge amount of visitors. And there's basically no trash on those rivers, and it's because of the ordinances. We're very happy to see Senate Bill 1126 get temporarily postponed in the Senate Committee Affairs Committee last week. That committee will not meet again. So we're hoping that is a good sign that we may have been able to stop it there. We owe a big debt of gratitude to Senator Jennifer Bradley, who represents a lot of our Springs areas and really cares about our Springs and state parks and really took a stand to keep that bill from advancing in the Senate. And then we had good news this morning when House Bill 1641 was also temporarily postponed in its committee. We put out an alert on that. We only get about 24 hours, so we were able to get a quick alert out and generate hundreds and hundreds of emails and calls. It looks like that was effective because that was also temporarily postponed. So, nothing's dead until they, meet in the middle and drop the handkerchiefs on March 8th, but it's looking like we might be able to run out the clock on these bad bills and at least keep the ordinances that we have in place. Where we need to be going is overturning that moratorium so that more local governments can be doing these kind of things, more state parks. We can have more of these protections, which are so important for not only, the beauty of our natural resources, but water quality with all the problems of microplastics and nanoplastics and human health and all the bad things that come from these.
You guys and Surfrider too have done great work on this one, and I certainly hope it succeeds. Do you have a sense of who's really pushing this? We did with the fertilizer issue.
Well, they're so good at hiding behind their lobbying groups. So you have the Retail Federation, whatever that is, and a plastics group. But I think it's clear that there are some of the very large retailers in the state that are behind this. One of the things we've been noting in our lobbying is that not one single retailer has gotten up in support of the bill. There's just been a couple of shady groups waving from the background in support of these. But we brought about 20 advocates, homeowners, people who would actually be affected by this to Tallahassee last week. And speaking to one of the legislators, she commented that no one's ever approached me to say this is a real problem, this is a real financial problem. They say this is a good economic bill for Florida. It's clearly not. It's just clearly not. People don't come here because they want plastic bags and single-use containers. People come to Florida because of our beaches, our springs, the Everglades, our water resources, our state parks, fishing. That's what generates revenue in Florida. So it's a bad bill any way you cut it.
Well put.
All right.
And then a couple others, and this gets to one of the comments in the chat. So Senate Bill 1620, I think, was my least favorite bill coming into session. This is a bill that would allow the Department of Environmental Protection to unilaterally surplus state-owned conservation lands within the Florida Wildlife Corridor, even lands that were bought decades ago. And right now, there's already a process for surplusing lands. It's a good process. It's been completely non-controversial over decades. It requires the knowledgeable people at the Acquisition and Restoration Council to make a determination that the lands do not have conservation value. And then it has to go all the way to the cabinet. And the cabinet has to vote to surplus the lands. This would have shortcut all of that and allowed essentially the Department of Environmental Protection to take a forest right now that's providing habitat, water benefits, ecosystem services, sell that off at a huge discount to an agricultural operator who could clear cut it, level it, and plant row crops. And of course, row crops are not good habitat, and they're the number one source of pollution to outstanding Florida springs. So, this really would have been a death blow. It never got a hearing. However, last week, an amendment was filed to the Department of Agriculture and Consumer Services bill, which is Senate Bill 1084, that would have added this language onto it. Fortunately, the sponsor saw the light and withdrew his amendment before it came to a vote. But I'm still very concerned that this could pop up at a later date. There's nothing wrong with surplusing. Sometimes you have to buy a land you don't need and you have to pay to surplus it, but we have to make sure we keep that scientific process, and we have to make sure that we're not going to allow more intense development or intense agriculture on these lands once they're surplused. And then the other one we're tracking is Senate Bill 1386, House Bill 1557, the Department of Environmental Protection's legislative package for this year. It's got some really good things like the Kristen Jacobs Aquatic Preserve in it that everyone supports. But it's also got some troubling language related to consumptive use permits. Typically, you can only get a consumptive use permit for 20 years, and that's because that's as far as we plan to. Our regional water supply plans are 20 years, our minimum flows and levels are 20 years, our basin management action plans are 20 years. If we could plan beyond 20 years, we would. But at that point, you really don't know what's going to happen. So it's very troubling to allow a 30-year consumptive use permit. Now, those permits would be tied to reclaimed water projects, which can be beneficial in some situations. However, the way the bill reads now, you would only have to propose a reclaimed water project. You wouldn't actually have to build one. So it's very easy to propose a reclaimed water project, get your 30-year permit, and never actually build it. So that language, at the very least, needs to be tightened up to make sure that the reclaimed water is not going to be adding pollution to our waterways. And even in that case, a 20-year permit is just fine. Instead of incentivizing, we need to be regulating. I thought it was, the beginning of the bill says to require water restrictions greater than the consumptive use permit. Well, we could just require more conservation in the permits instead of giving handouts to developers for doing alternative water supply projects.
Right.
All right. What about
so let's,
the budget?
let's talk about the budget.
I'm still looking at Bugs Bunny. So.
Yeah, I had to throw that in there for a little levity at the end here. We are at the point in the legislative session where we have the House version of the budget, we have the Senate version of the budget. In the case of Everglades funding, they are vastly far apart. There's a huge divide. Gil, I was hoping you'd talk a little bit about that gap, and then Ryan, would love to hear from you on the Springs and Florida Forever funding and other issues. So, Gil.
Sure. So Governor DeSantis called for another huge outlay for Everglades funding. When it comes to capital outlay, he's talking about $614 million for Everglades funding. And the House matched that in their budget proposal, but the Senate proposes spending just over $300 million, about half of what's in the House budget. And the Senate bill also articulates which projects the money would be spent on, and it leaves a lot of big ones out. Not articulated is the EAA Reservoir, which is a huge project going on in the Everglades agricultural area. Planning for Biscayne Bay Southeastern Everglades Ecosystem, or BBCER, is not included in what this money could fund. Planning for the Western Everglades Restoration Project, or WERP, is not included in what this money would fund. There's a whole bunch of other ones. And so there's a huge concern amongst those who advocate for Everglades funding that what's going to happen here is if the Senate doesn't come up on the funding, you're going to short shrift funding for some of these key projects, which rely also on federal funds, federal matching funds. Those federal matching funds could dry up as the state money dries up, and some of these projects could dry up. So there's significant concern. We have been talking to legislators. In fact, we were part of Everglades Action Day last week, I guess it was, where this was sort of a big issue. And we were talking to legislators, particularly senators, about the need to come up. Hopefully there's going to be, they're going to see the light on this issue. But obviously, if you have projects that you've already poured hundreds of millions of dollars into, and the funding begins to dry up, it's going to cause a real problem in terms of getting those projects done, seeing the benefits of those projects delivered to the greater Everglades ecosystem.
Yeah. Thanks, Gil. I'll just add that Friends of the Everglades often serves as a watchdog on project design, on projects like the EAA Reservoir. We've been vocal in our concerns about the configuration of it. We also have raised questions about water quality in the Western Everglades Restoration Project. That doesn't mean that we think all funding should dry up and planning should stop, because we do need to finish these projects, and we do need to make sure that they are effective. So it would be terrible for taxpayers and the public at large to make these massive multi-billion-dollar investments and then halt everything. So curious to see where the Senate ends up. This might just be a posturing move with some other poker chips in play, but we'll find out. Ryan, how about Florida Forever? It's lower than I know most of our groups would like to see, but not terrible, I suppose.
Right. Well, it's the legal minimum after the bill passed last year. So 100 million is the lowest that they can give to Florida Forever. I think no matter what it is you're interested in protecting, land conservation is the absolute best way to go about it. When we sometimes we have to do big infrastructure projects and we have to re-engineer things. But Mother Nature does a wonderful job of healing and protecting herself when you let her do it. And the way we can do that is through robust land conservation programs like Florida Forever. So, we would love to see that funded at least the historic average of 300 million. And considering that Florida voters unanimously passed the Land Acquisition Trust Fund, you could make a real credible argument that number should be closer to $1 billion a year. And we could absolutely spend it. The amount of projects that we have willing sellers waiting to be funded through rural and family lands and Florida Forever and Florida Communities Trust is enormous. There's an enormous backlog, and we need to get those properties protected, whether in fee simple acquisition or conservation easements, as soon as possible.
And Florida Forever is an award-winning, very popular land buying program that under former Governor Jeb Bush got $300 million a year, roughly. So this is really something that could benefit from an influx in cash.
Absolutely, and also at the lowest possible funding, unfortunately, is Springs restoration funding. You know, when I hear the differences between $1 billion and $350 million, I kind of get jealous because the Springs only get $50 million every year, and you know, just the cost to restore one of our outstanding Florida Springs rainbow is likely $2 to $3 billion. And you know, the fact is, if we continue to get $50 million in funding each year, there really is no chance to restore the majority of our springs. And that's why we see water quality in springs continue to decline, you know, even 8 years after the legislature passed the Florida Springs and Aquifer Protection Act, that requires them to do better. They're not doing better. We're seeing, you know, higher nitrate levels throughout the spring sheds despite that law. And it's because, you know, if we're not going to regulate things, we really need to put the funding in to conserve land, convert septic tanks, and do all of that. And unfortunately, the legislature is choosing neither. They're choosing not to fund projects and they're choosing not to regulate. And that is completely unworkable. And to that, one of the other things we're concerned about is an appropriation. Again, you're going to hear about IFAS at the University of Florida. You know, just as they were involved in the study on urban fertilizer ordinances, they're also looking at the fertilizer rate for agricultural products, specifically some of the biggies. Up here in the spring zone, our biggest problem is corn. Corn is what the majority of the acres around here are grown on. And because this area is not very good for corn, this isn't the Midwest where I lived as a kid for a few years. This is Florida, and we have, you know, sandy soils and we don't have much of it left, and you've got the aquifer right underneath it. So it requires enormous amounts of fertilizer. And remarkably, IFAS wants to increase the amount of nitrate and fertilizer that can be put on crops. So we've seen some of the early studies that would go from the current recommendation, which is 240 pounds a year per acre of nitrate, to 350 pounds. And there's just no way that our springs could absorb that much pollution. So, you know, these studies, although they're for best management practices, which you think would include water quality, when you actually read the language in the budget, they don't take water quality into account at all. The only thing they're taking into account is the yield. And, you know, not only is that terrible for the environment, but really, you know, we're subsidizing in kind of an unspoken way these agricultural practices, because all this money, this taxpayer money, our money that's coming out of the budget, right, is just being used basically to try to hold the line on agricultural pollution. So at the very least, if we're going to be looking at these best management practices, we need to be taking water quality into account.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, this is the kiss of death for Lake Okeechobee as well, where the vast majority of the pollution is agricultural related. And the BMAPs, or base management action plans, are basically works of fiction. You know, we're not meeting the pollution reduction milestones. You know, we really have no realistic prospect of meeting the pollution reduction milestones. And if something like this happens, you're going to be even further away from those goals. So it's crazy.
Right. And, you know, a bunch of the Florida Springs Council members actually took DEP to court over the Basin Management Action Plans up here. And we won at the First District Court of Appeals, which instructed DEP to write plans that comply with the law. Unfortunately, instead of doing that, DEP just removed all the plans. So now these springs that should have better protections do not have protections at all. And they're telling us to wait years and years and years until we can get new plans that we'll probably end up having to be, you know, back in court on. So it's incredibly disappointing to see, you know, a lot of us worked really hard on Senate Bill 552 back in 2016, and to have state agencies that are just, you know, really dedicated to making sure the law is not followed. You know, it's a really, really hard thing to deal with. And it's, you know, we can see the results, you know, that we can see the results in the water quality graphs. We can see the results in flow. Things are getting worse when they are required by law to get better. And it's because the state agencies aren't following the law.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. We see the same thing down here. Absolutely.
Yeah, definitely. Well, I think that's the last slide in our presentation, right, Gil? We can take
Just
Bugs Bunny down? Oh, sure. I'll put in a plug for our holding lawmakers accountable section of our website at everglades.org. It's under legislative accountability. You can go to that Bills We're Watching button to see the latest. We're updating that just about every day this time of year. And Ryan, I know you also have a great section of your website at the Florida Springs Council site where you can track legislation that relates directly to the Florida Springs. And there's a lot of overlap between these two ecosystems and water quality issues, as you all are hearing now. So I think we can take the slides down. We'll talk for a few more minutes. I want to remind our audience that if you have questions, we will get to some of those in the last 15 minutes or so. I see we have some questions coming in from Instagram, which is great. We just started with our last live stream a month ago, streaming live to Instagram. So glad to see you all tuning in there. Yeah, I just want to say one more thing about this fertilizer and rate tailoring. It brings to mind an excellent author and journalist, Dan Egan, who came to Stewart not too long ago to do some reporting for the New York Times. And he wrote an excellent book called The Devil's Element. It's about phosphorus. And the great irony of this effort to increase fertilizer allowances and crop yields through fertilizer application is that phosphorus is in limited supply. So we are overusing it. It's washing into our waters. I think Dan said, it's a miracle on land and misery in the water. And then we're going to be in trouble when we run out of this element that's so necessary in the future. So there's a real irony there, a lot of short-term thinking. And we see that a lot, unfortunately, in water policy, that the short-term profit motive trumps all else. That's what we're working against. So with that said, I'm going to ask you guys a couple of general questions here. So we've got 4 weeks left in session, 4 weeks from Friday. Session will wrap up, barring any extensions. What do you think is the biggest opportunity for us in these 4 weeks? I'll start with Ryan.
Well, the last few weeks are really going to be dedicated to the budget. That's kind of how the sausage gets made. So, we're already seeing all the subcommittees have shut down. I think after next week or the beginning of the week after, we're going to see all the policy committees shut down. Everything's going to be up on the floor. So this is really the opportunity to, work on those budget issues, try to increase funding for those really critical environmental priorities like Everglades restoration, Springs restoration, Florida forever, all of those good things.
Gil?
I would say as these committee hearings wind down, we have the opportunity to sort of beat back some of these bad bills we've been talking about. And again, to the extent it takes people such as those who are watching this show today to sort of sound off. I mean, that's been effective this year. And so we're really happy when people have taken, sort of taken up that baton and run with it. There may be opportunities to do that here in these next couple of weeks before we, before the committee hearing shut down. And it's good. I mean, I think we've generated a little momentum in that respect this year. So it's heartening to see because I think we can use it.
Yeah, the response that we saw is really an opportunity, the citizen response. If we can harness that again when bad bills start flying at the end here or bad budget provisions, I think we can really make a difference. I want to mention too, we noticed a lot more people making phone calls this past time when we asked, and I think that makes a difference. You can send a pre-formatted email and we want to make it easy for you, but a phone call from a real citizen with real concerns about legislation that a staffer has to answer at the Capitol really makes a difference. So thank you all for doing that.
Yeah, I mean, I think absolutely, it just briefly, it absolutely says to the legislators, there's a lot of people out there paying attention to this, and it's got to give them pause, and that's what you want. So.
Right.
I just heard a legislator this morning say, well, I don't know where this opposition's coming from. Not one person has called or emailed my office on this bill. And I've heard the opposite many times this session where people have gotten thousands of emails, and especially if you can call your legislator, it's one of the tricky things because the committees move so fast and, you might not have your legislator, but if your legislator is on a committee that's hearing a bill, definitely pick up the phone and call their office. We hundreds of phone calls to one senator's office this session on the trash bill really made a difference because they were all constituents. Mm-hmm. And when you're hearing, when your phone's ringing off the hook, when you come in after the weekend on Monday and you've got 80, 90 voicemails, all from constituents on the same issue. That's not a form letter. That's not a bot. They know those are real people who really care and that there's going to be consequences. And, we've heard legislators say, I don't want to go home and get yelled at by a group of people outside my office for doing this. So, I like to say we can't promise we'll win every time you take action, but we will always lose if y'all don't take action, because you are the great equalizer that we have up there, where we're not able to be handing out the same size checks as some of those folks, but we have the real people, the voters behind us. And, it makes a huge difference to, I know, my lobbying work. I know Gil's lobbying work. It's incredibly important.
Absolutely. It helps us put points on the board, and that's what we got to do. So.
Yep. Okay. Thank you both for that. So I'll ask you the flip side of that question. The biggest threat looming ahead. You both kind of alluded to some threats in your opportunity answers, but I'll ask anyway.
The majority party has they have a super majority in both chambers, which means they can pretty much waive their own rules at will, and do what they like. So absolutely nothing is dead. We have to keep, working on this until the last minute. Anything that's passed one committee can be amended onto any other germane bill. So, these last 4 weeks, we've won some really great battles this session. But, to really carry through and get through this session in pretty good shape, we need to really keep strong the last 4 weeks and keep the advocacy up and make sure that they don't try anything fast to get any of these bad provisions back in.
Yeah, and I suppose the threat is fatigue of resident citizens, right? We had wonderful involvement out the gate. Again, thank you all who helped with that. But you all have busy lives. We all have busy lives, and this stuff can wear you down. Let's not let it.
Mm-hmm. And I would say I'm waiting for the urban fertilizer bill to drop. I mean, I'm just waiting, because this is how it happened last year. Caught everybody by surprise, and luckily some folks who, make sure they read everything coming out, read it, saw it, alerted the community, tried to mobilize against it, but it was late in the game. And so if you're a wily legislator looking to get something like this through this year, you're going to wait until the last minute, when there's less of an opportunity to mobilize against it. So, the good thing, as noted earlier, is that a lot of us are sort of watching this issue like a hawk. But it could happen the way it happened last year, in which case it might be tough. So.
Yeah. You mentioned, Gil, that other allies are wonderful at reading every bit of legislation that comes through, and we all do our best. I just want to mention that we have a comment on Facebook from Yvonne Beckman, who said it's a great idea to bundle various environmental groups and work together. We do this often, and we have, I think, kind of kindred spirits out there that we know we can trust and lock arms with. And it does make a difference, because we're both relatively small organizations, right? Friends of the Everglades and Florida Springs Council. We have many supporters that can constitute a large group, but in terms of funding, we're small. And if we can join together, it does make a difference. Okay, so we're going to take some questions from the audience now. I'll ask Allie Hartman, our communications director, to queue up any questions that she wants to tee up. Okay, Howard Balin. Hi, Howard. Howard asks, what can citizens from around the state do aside from directly contacting legislators to deliver key messages? Things like media outreach, letters to the editor, bylines, PR-wise, what works? Gil, you want to take a swipe at that?
Well, I think we just moments ago talked about how effective, personal phone calls are. But short of that, I mean, I do think letters to the editor are often a fairly simple way for you to convey your point of view in the local media. Op-eds are great too, but there's a process that you got to go through to get those published, which can maybe be a little tougher than like a letter to the editor. And, again, and having worked for local news outlets, if you're getting a bunch of people who are sending letters to the editor on some of these issues, that is going to clue them in, if they're not already clued into the fact that this is an issue that's important to a lot of people. And maybe we actually ought to be going out there and covering it from the news side, as well as printing these letters to the editor. So that sort of thing, if there's a bit of a groundswell, can sort of feed on itself and roll forward and generate additional media coverage of these issues. Because I think a lot of times it's very effective if you're able to, if your local newspaper, your local TV station has reporters who cover these issues, that's always an opportunity for you to call or email those folks and say, hey, did you know there's this bill coming down the pike and it's going to do this? And there's a lot of people who are opposed to it. Might be a story, and the more exposure you can get, the more people can be alerted to what's happening, the more people can do something about it, can take action. So I think that's a good thing to sort of aim for. And then again, so if you are able to contact your local media, if you're able to send a letter to the editor, that sort of thing, it just, the more people know about it, the better off we're going to be.
Thanks, Gil. Anything to add, Ryan?
Nailed it.
Okay. All right. I'll take a question from Instagram now. I don't think we're able to pop those in so the audience can see them. So I will just read this one. A question from Instagram is, I live near the Estero Bay Aquatic Preserve. Can you share more info about that bill? So I'll jump in on this one and Gil, add anything you'd like to. But by way of background, the Estero Bay Aquatic Preserve was established in 1966, and a group of conservationists in Southwest Florida wanted to protect this really beautiful part of the ecosystem that is also very economically valuable. Unfortunately, this bill would reduce its boundaries, and it's unclear what exactly the motives are. And we signed on to a letter asking the lawmakers behind this bill not to move forward. And that was one of the questions we raised. The reasons for the bill were really opaque, and we didn't understand the need for the boundary change. And in addition to that, this could have really damaging statewide implications by setting a precedent for reducing aquatic preserve boundaries once they're established. Brian mentioned the DEP bill would potentially create a new aquatic preserve stretching from the Stewart area up in Martin County all the way down to Biscayne Bay, huge area that deserves additional protections. Why establish a preserve if we can shrink the boundaries in the future? It makes it kind of meaningless.
Yeah, Adam Batana, the representative who sponsored the House bill on this, has said that removing San Carlos Island from the aquatic preserve would help the shrimp industry rebuild from the devastation of Hurricane Ian. I think there's a lot of people who agree that we need to do what we can to help the shrimp industry, but without compromising the preserve. So, and I think you would compromise the preserve if you're going to shrink it. So,
okay, thanks, Gil. We'll take another question, Allie. Mary Stevens asks, is it a good idea for cities to limit fertilizer usage during the rainy season at this point, or is it still not feasible due to the legislation being in limbo? Good question. Do you guys want to clarify that?
So the current moratorium was a 1-year moratorium that went into effect on July 1st. So it goes from July 1st, 2023 to July 1st, 2024. That's kind of our year in Florida government. So if nothing was done this session to extend that moratorium, local governments would be able to enact new fertilizer ordinances with blackout periods starting this summer. And that's, we know there's local governments that want to do that, and we need to give them the power to do it.
That's right. So we'll be watching for any budget provisions that extend that moratorium and asking for a veto of that, just like we did last time. Okay, we'll take another question, Allie. If we have more from Facebook, or I can tackle some more from Instagram. Yvonne Beckman asks, I live in a 55+ community and water quality is poor already, yet more houses are built and costly water filters are big business here. What can be done? Interesting question, kind of alludes to this trend in Florida water policy to treat the symptoms, not the disease. So do either of you want to weigh in here?
Just to go big picture, this is my, I think, 12th session doing this, or 13th. And my first session was the session where the Growth Management Act got repealed and got replaced with the Community Planning Act. And all of the talk was that we need to return the power to local governments to regulate planning. And local governments, a lot of them adapted, and they have been trying to do a good job of regulating growth. And now we're seeing the state basically attempt to preempt any local governments from regulating growth. And I have to think this was kind of the plan all along. First you get rid of the Department of Community Affairs, you've got the state planners, the state agencies, all of the state planning laws, and now you're preventing local governments from doing the same. So we need to allow local governments to have the power to protect their resources. And I mean, it really is what's closest to the people, and it's where people can have the biggest effect, is, in that comprehensive planning and land use protection. So, we need to hold those ordinances.
I would agree with that. And I would say, the trend that we see is to disempower not only local governments, but individual citizens. I mean, go back to what we were talking about, House Bill 789, Senate Bill 738, which would force citizens or groups like Ryan's who want to challenge an administrative, decision, or want to challenge like an FDEP or water management decision, would punish them. This would have punished them by saddling them with the other side's legal fees. Again, we saw similar legislation last year when it came to community comprehensive plans or comprehensive plan amendments. So at a time when Florida's growth continues, to break records, and the issue of, smart growth is maybe more salient than ever before, there are attempts not only to preempt regulation of this from local communities who are in the position to regulate this the best because they know the facts on the ground. There's an attempt to preempt that, but there's also an attempt to intimidate, and I use that term very specifically, to intimidate citizens from participating in the process and raising any objections. So it's like at a time when we ought to be thinking about being more cautious than we've been in the past, we're throwing caution to the wind. It's just full speed ahead. And that's why you see all these pro sprawl bills last year and this year, probably next year. There's a gold rush mentality, and unfortunately, it's already led to problems. It's already contributing to water quality issues, and it's going to continue to do so until we sort of shift the thinking. But that's a big lift.
Yeah, you can really see the long game when you spell it out like that, going back to, what was it, 2011, the repeal of the Department of Community Affairs, and the decade that's followed. It's pretty depressing, but the silver lining is that citizens see the results and they're not happy about it, and we're pushing back. Okay, I think we have time for a couple more questions. I'll take one from Instagram here. Oh, never mind. We'll go with Randy Burr. Are there specific legislators who your organization believes can be the most helpful with all these environmental causes that citizens should focus on contacting? If so, can you post their contact info on your website? I'm going to go back to something Ryan said. I think contacting your own lawmaker, if you're in district, contact your lawmaker. And we can certainly share in the chat the information about how to put your address in and look up your lawmaker. There are helpful lawmakers out there. I mean, Representative Lindsay Cross comes from the environmental movement. She's generally with us on these issues, so you may not need to contact her. You guys have any other thoughts?
No, that's it. It's really about identifying legislators whose districts are going to be affected in a negative way by whatever's in front of them, and making sure that they're aware of it, and that they know that their constituents are paying attention and don't want it to happen. So, there's a lot of good folks up there that, you really don't have to call because they're going to have us, our backs. It's the ones where you can kind of work on the edges and find people who have, particular interests that allow them to be moved to maybe vote against the way they normally would have or would be expected to. And that's how we get the victories.
And I would add, I could just give you a local example here in Martin County where we are. Representative John Snyder is not on any committees that deal with any of these water quality issues. He's not a guy who's sort of in the game, so to speak, when it comes to that topic. But his district is going to be affected by these discharges from Lake Okeechobee that we mentioned earlier. So while that may not be something on his, or it may not have been something on his radar, during this session, all of a sudden this becomes a salient issue for him. All of a sudden this becomes a big deal for him because this affects his constituents. And to the extent that his constituents reach out to him and say, what are you doing about this? Well, you better be doing something about this. All of a sudden, a guy who's not really been involved in sort of some of this clean water legislation is in tune with some of these clean water issues because he has to be. And I think that's the case across the board in Florida. There are some legislators who are definitely in tune with these issues and trying to do what they can in terms of conservation. There are other legislators who are in tune with the issues, but they're behind bills to, increase sprawl, whatever it is. Then there are those who just aren't really in tune with these issues, but they will be, and they must be, and you can make them be if these issues or when these issues are impacting them, their district, their constituents locally. And you just got to make them aware.
With the couple minutes we have left, I have to ask you this question, Ryan, because I'm curious about your answer. This one came in from Rhonda Roth on Instagram. In the Springs, are politicians more beholden to agriculture or developers?
Politicians is hard. I don't know exactly what you mean by politicians. We don't have a commissioner of development. We don't have a commissioner of tourism. We have a commissioner of agriculture. In my experience, the most powerful lobby in Tallahassee on our issues is by far and away the folks who represent agriculture. I also don't know that there's a huge difference. In the real world, there's a big difference between farmers and developers. Not so much in the capital. The Aggies and the developers are you'd have a hard time figuring out who is who based on what they're supporting up in Tallahassee.
Well put. You could say the same in the Everglades region. Instead of corn, it's sugarcane. So thanks for that answer, Ryan. I'm going to give you guys a moment for some last words as we head into this home stretch of session before we wrap up. Gil, I'll start with you.
It's easy to be a pessimist in this line of work, right? And there's reason for it. But I think, as I mentioned at the outset, this session has gone a little differently than I feared when we first started. And I say this with all the caveats in place. There's still time for everything to go south. There's still time for the budget to look, to be terrible. There's still time for stuff to be snuck in, sneak attacks. But I think we should at least be heartened to a certain extent by what's happened so far this session, because, from our perspective, some of the worst bills that we thought, oh my gosh, if this goes through, this is going to be a nightmare, have sort of gotten scuttled or just haven't gone anywhere. And that's a good thing. That's a good thing. And given how many people have responded and reached out to their legislators, you like to think that maybe this is the start of something better. So let me hope for that. So.
That's the first optimism I've ever heard from Gil.
It won't become a habit. So,
Ryan, last words from you.
It must run in the family. It's we don't want folks to get complacent, but I think what we've achieved this session is remarkable. I want to get to the point where we're advancing really good bills every year. That's where we need to be, right? If we, 30 years ago, when I was, 13 growing up in Florida, it would have been fine to just be stopping the bad stuff. But, we need to be. But until that day comes, we have to hold the line. Like, we really have to hold the line and not let things go backwards. And I think it's been a real shift this session. I mean, last year, it was hard to even get a vote against that bill that would have done the mandatory attorney fees for the comprehensive plan amendments that passed. This year we were able to, at least as of now, stop that for environmental challenges in its tracks. So I'm hearing a lot more feedback about the effectiveness of the environmental community. And I really think that, I'm seeing a lot of folks work together. Everglades and Springs and coastal people all on the same bills, all advocating together, all, hitting the pressure points that we have, and it's working. And I'm feeling more optimistic about this session and what we can accomplish going forward. I think we've identified some new champions on issues that can be very helpful. And, we just have to 4 more weeks. We just have to hold out for 4 more weeks, get past this session, and, work next year on getting some good bills advanced.
Thanks, Ryan. Thanks for all you do. Your dozen years of experience up there are really paying off. And I think we are stronger together. It's not just a catchphrase. So thanks for your time over the past hour. We will be in touch, and we will come back to you, Gil and I, at the end of session, perhaps with another guest or two to talk about where we ended up. So thank you all, and we'll see you next time. Take care.